Imagine a man so powerful that the rules of the world simply bent around him. Before we begin, ask yourself 3 questions. Who was the man who secretly held a first-class ticket for the maiden voyage of the Titanic, but mysteriously cancelled at the last possible minute, avoiding the icy depths of the Atlantic? Who was the shadow broker that financed the sale of defective exploding rifles to his own military during the bloodiest war in American history and walked away without a single criminal charge? And who was the private citizen who literally locked the wealthiest men in America inside a private library, pocketed the key, and forced them to save the United States government from total collapse? Most people believe the president runs the country, but in the early 20th century, one man proved that the president answered to him. His name was John Pierpont Morgan. We know Carnegie built the steel, we know Rockefeller pumped the oil, but J.P. Morgan, he didn't build, he bought. He was the ultimate apex predator of capitalism, a man who treated the American economy like his own personal chessboard. But behind the tailored suits and the mountain of gold lay a trail of blood, manipulation, and a terrifying psychological secret. This is the untold story of the banker who bought America and the terrifying price the country paid for it. To understand the darkness of J.P. Morgan, we must travel back to 1861. The American Civil War has just begun. While hundreds of thousands of young men marched to their deaths, Morgan stayed in New York. He avoided the draft by simply paying a substitute $300 to fight and die in his place. To Morgan, the war wasn't a tragedy. It was a business opportunity. In what became known as the Hall Carbine affair, the 24-year-old Morgan financed a truly sinister deal. The United States government had condemned 5,000 obsolete rifles known as Hall Carbines. The Army considered them dangerous junk, selling them off as scrap for a mere $3.50 each. A middleman approached Morgan for a $20,000 loan. Morgan provided the cash at 7% interest to buy those exact same condemned weapons. They spent about 75 cents per gun to alter them and immediately sold them back to a desperate Union general in the field for $22 apiece. Legend has it that these defective rifles were so incredibly dangerous they blew the thumbs off the very soldiers trying to fire them in the heat of battle. When the government realized they had been swindled, they were outraged. They refused to pay the final bill. Most men would have fled the scandal in shame. But Morgan? He had the absolute audacity to sue the United States government for his money, and he won. He learned his most valuable lesson early. If you hold the money, you hold the power. The law is only for the poor. From that day forward, he didn't just participate in the market, he dominated it through a brutal process the newspapers called Morganization. He would find struggling, bleeding businesses, ruthlessly fire their management, and merge them into massive, unstoppable monopolies. Morgan grew into a terrifying, towering figure. He stood 6 feet tall, with massive shoulders and fierce eyes that were famously described as the headlights of an oncoming express train. But the most feared man in America, the man who controlled entire industries, harbored a deeply embarrassing, humiliating secret. From his younger years, Morgan suffered from a horrific skin condition called rosacea, which eventually developed into severe rhinophyma. It caused massive growths and ruptured blood vessels on his nose, turning it into what cruel witnesses called a purple cauliflower. For a man obsessed with control and his public image, this physical deformity was absolute psychological torture. He became violently paranoid about his appearance. If a photographer dared to take his picture on the street without permission, Morgan would attack them, brutally beating them with his heavy walking cane. He spent a massive fortune ensuring that every official portrait was heavily retouched and painted over to hide his deformity from the public eye. But Morgan was a genius master of turning a weakness into a lethal weapon. Instead of hiding his face in shame, he used his terrifying appearance to dominate the men sitting across from him. When a rival banker or a desperate CEO sat at Morgan's mahogany desk, Morgan would lean heavily into the light, letting his hideous, deformed features and piercing eyes paralyze them with absolute fear. He didn't just negotiate, he demanded total surrender. By the turn of the 20th century, he had conquered railroads and electricity. But in 1901, he set his predatory sights on the biggest, most untouchable target in the world. He wanted the untouchable steel empire of Andrew Carnegie. At the dawn of the new century, Andrew Carnegie was the undisputed king of industry. But J.P. Morgan absolutely hated Carnegie. Carnegie was chaotic, aggressive, and highly unpredictable. Morgan demanded absolute order. So, Morgan decided to do something no one on Wall Street thought was mathematically possible. He decided to simply buy Carnegie out. Through a middleman, Morgan asked Carnegie for his final price. Carnegie scribbled a massive number on a small slip of paper. $480 million. An astronomical, utterly unheard of sum for the time. Morgan looked at the scrap of paper and simply said, I accept. Morgan combined Carnegie's massive empire with other heavy manufacturing companies to create US Steel. It was the very first billion-dollar corporation in human history. By this time, J.P. Morgan didn't just control the steel that built the cities, he controlled half the railroad tracks spanning across America. He owned entire fleets of transatlantic shipping lines. He backed Thomas Edison to create General Electric. Even the brilliant inventor Nikola Tesla was forced to sell Morgan the rights to his revolutionary wireless patents for a mere $150,000. Morgan was no longer just a wealthy banker. He was the invisible, beating engine running the United States. He held the power of a king, but without the nuisance of an election. But his ultimate test, the defining moment that would cement his legacy as either a brilliant savior or a ruthless dictator, arrived in October of 1907. It was the year the entire American economy flatlined. Millions of people were about to lose everything they had ever worked for, and the government was completely powerless to stop the bleeding. In the autumn of 1907, a failed scheme to corner the copper market triggered mass panic across Wall Street. Millions of terrified Americans rushed to their local banks to withdraw their life savings, only to find the vaults completely empty. At this time, the United States did not have a Federal Reserve or a central bank. The government was broke, blind, and completely powerless to stop the bleeding. There was only one man wealthy enough and terrifying enough to save the nation from total financial apocalypse. At 70 years old, J.P. Morgan stepped out of the shadows. He summoned roughly 120 of the leading bank and trust officials to his personal mahogany-paneled library in New York City. The men sat in the dimly lit, smoke-filled room, arguing, panicking, and refusing to risk their own institution's money to save the collapsing system. They were terrified. Morgan had heard enough. He stood up, walked to the heavy brass doors of the library, and locked them from the inside. He slid the only key into his coat pocket. He turned to the most powerful men in the country and gave a chilling ultimatum. No one leaves this room until you sign a pledge to bail out the economy with $25 million. For hours, the men were trapped like prisoners. Finally, at 4:45 in the morning, exhausted and utterly broken by Morgan's sheer, uncompromising force of will, they surrendered. They signed the paper. Morgan slowly unlocked the heavy door. He had single-handedly stopped the panic of 1907. But he had also proven something terrifying. America was completely at the mercy of one man. Morgan had saved America from total collapse, personally losing $21 million of his own money in the process. But instead of throwing him a parade, the public was absolutely horrified. The chilling idea that one unelected man, sitting in a private library, held the power of life and death over the entire American economy sparked massive national outrage. The government dragged him before an investigative committee to demand how he wielded such terrifying financial control. During the hostile hearing, a government lawyer asked him, "Is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property?" Morgan stared the man down and delivered the most famous quote of his life. "No, sir. The first thing is character, before money or anything else. A man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." Months later, in 1913, the ultimate architect of modern finance died in his sleep in Rome. When his will was finally read, the entire world was shocked. Morgan had left behind an estate worth roughly $80 million. It was a massive fortune, but nothing compared to the industrial billionaires he had created. When John D. Rockefeller read the news in the morning paper, he shook his head and whispered, "And to think, he wasn't even a rich man." So we return to the questions. Was J.P. Morgan a corrupt war profiteer who financed defective rifles? Yes. Was he a ruthless dictator who bullied the economy? Yes. But his sheer power forced the government to finally create the Federal Reserve. He didn't just play the game of capitalism, he was the one who built the board. My team and I have spent months tracking this legacy. Hit the like button and subscribe to join the inner circle. Your support fuels the hunt. Comment code below if you finish the journey. We'll see you in the next investigation.